Hello and welcome to Birds of Paradise's summary presentation for the Make It Accessible series of events.
So what was Make It Accessible? Make It Accessible was a collaboration between Birds of Paradise Theatre Company and Andy Edwards. That's me. I'm a playwright and dramaturg based in Glasgow. It was a working group for theatre makers in Scotland who were interested in creating accessible work, and it was open to all levels of experience and both disabled and non-disabled people. Make It Accessible was a series of Zoom events held throughout 2020, which covered topics including creating relaxed performances, marketing accessible work, and international approaches to access. It was a mixture of presentations from artists, producers, and venues, as well as Q&As and facilitated discussions. Make It Accessible was attended by over 200 people with presentations from 20 invited speakers based in Scotland and further afield. Ultimately, Make It Accessible was an opportunity to identify the barriers people face when trying to make their work accessible and to think about what support BOP could put in place or help other organisations to establish. So, what is this presentation? This presentation is a way to approach these events as a whole and think about four key themes that emerged within Make It Accessible. And these are 1. Innovation from deaf and disabled artists. 2. The link between allyship and access. 3. The tension between exploration and instruction. And 4. The role of making accessible work in changing attitudes. This presentation is also intended as a learning resource for people who are interested in making accessible work, and it's a way as well to highlight the important contributions made to our event by our invited speakers. If you are interested, you can watch recordings of the presentations from Make It Accessible 2 to 5 at www.boptheatre.co.uk/make-it-accessible.
So the first theme I want to talk about is innovation from deaf and disabled artists. So our invited speakers consistently demonstrated how deaf and disabled artists are using their unique position to create innovative means for audiences to access their work. They're really the vanguard, I suppose, of things that are changing and developing. These innovations included embracing digital technologies and using their own experience of using access tools to dismantle them and rebuild them. These presentations also highlighted how much of this innovation occurred in DIY, do-it-yourself, or alternative contexts, happening beyond the reach of major venues and touring networks. This first clip is from performance artist Chisato Minamimura, describing how she embraced technology when making Scored in Silence and what it means for her work to be deaf-led.
So that gives you a little glimpse into some of the elements that were used in the piece. So there was movement, BSL, sign mime, visual vernacular, animation, photography, filming, and projection onto a screen. The kind of screen I used was a hollow gauze, it's called, a hollow gauze. This is a particular type of technology that allows a 2D image to be recreated as a 3D image. I also had a very specific soundscape, which came from a sonic artist, and we used this equipment to offer this to the audience. This is a Woodger belt, a Woodger strap. I had around 50 of those straps that I was able to tour with and offer to the audience. So 50 people in the audience, whether they were deaf or hearing, that wasn't an issue. It was offered to anyone in the audience who wanted to experience the sonic soundscape from with a felt and embodied experience. It was very effective. I also offered audio description as part of the production for anyone who was visually impaired in the audience. So the access that we offered was artistically grounded. So each of these elements came from the practice of a deaf artist. They were very much deaf elements because they were grounded in a very strong visual sense. And the question, I suppose, then is how you create these deaf elements. And what's really important for me is the phrase deaf-led. And for some people, that isn't automatically a clear phrase. What that means, though, is that I led the project as a deaf artist, and that communication between myself and the hearing team was very clear.
Great. And so this second clip is from director Alison Woodhouse, and then separately a second clip that's sort of joined together from performer Emma McCaffrey, describing how their experience of accessing theatre have informed their approaches to making it and experimenting with different means of access.
If anything, my experience with audio description prior to my introduction to accessible theatre has actually, it's strange because I used to obviously go to the theatre and listen to, you'd have audio description night, and you would sort of sit and you would have your little headset on and listen to the audio description through the headset, and so on and so forth. And I found that very distracting. And if anything, the not particularly positive experiences I've had with non-integrated access theatre is probably the biggest driving force behind what I decided to do with this, because I wanted the audio description to become part of the story itself. And as I said, when we did the Blood Wedding tour, actually, that was probably the first experience I'd had with that, because what the characters did there was they would sort of stay at the top, hi, my name is, and they would say what their name was as an actor, hi, my name's Irene McDougall and I'm playing so-and-so, and this is what my character looks like, blah, blah, blah. And they would put in the audio description there, and that was more like what I wanted to do, but it still wasn't quite. It still felt it was an extra piece of work. Whereas for something like Holmes or Watson, I mean, the part of the fun of these stories is that they describe the clients. Usually Holmes and Watson both notice different things, and we had a lot of fun in the Dundee week when we was like, actually, which one do you believe, and could you put both of these different audio describers together to create a picture? So that's probably where my idea of audio description has come from, really. It's sprung from, and it's a method I want to keep doing with whatever I do.
One of the things in theatre is that you do tend to have to sit in one place, and if you get the urge to stemming is the repetitiveness of movement, which is what we go through. You have to really think about, okay, how can I do it and not annoy the audience? Was with the reason I jumped, we didn't want that. We wanted particularly autistic members of the audience to feel they were good to go in terms of how they wanted to experience the show. If they wanted to just sit on the grass and just let the sun hit their face while we were just talking behind it, they didn't want to listen at all. They just wanted to run around in circles. So be it. We wanted them to not feel they had to just stand and listen or sit or listen to us, because we just wanted them to feel we cared a lot about the autistic members of the cast anyway. From our point of view, we talked a lot with Graham and the NTS about how we felt the autistic members would react, so we did provide a lot of information from there.
And next we have neurodivergent poet and performer Inkasha Hemp talking about the exciting potential of radical relaxed performances.
I want to think for a second about how we talk about relaxed performances. In marketing and articles, the most often utilized descriptions are about turning down the volume, taking stuff out, reducing. And I understand this narrative being used to explain relaxed performances to prospective audience members. but I really don't think it helps us as creators to understand what we are doing. These descriptions help to reinforce the idea that to make relaxed work, you first make a normal show, in inverted commas, and then adapt it. Something that is reflected in the way people frame questions to me when we are discussing relaxed work. People will ask, how did you go about making Sato smile with a relaxed show? When the truth is, as I already said, I just made a show. The show was never going to be not going to be relaxed. It was never going to be an uncomfortable show. We just focused on making the best piece we could and then sharing that the same way each and every day of the run. Because, I mean, disabled people don't just exist during midday matinees on a Wednesday. Relaxed performances should not be lesser adaptations of a good thing. They are not badly made versions attempting or pretending to be something they're not. This is not theatre watered down, reduced or diluted. Turning down the volume does not mean diminishing. Relaxed performance spaces are radical. And as a sector, I think we need to reframe our perception of them to reflect that. They are strong and beautiful and vulnerable. Relaxed spaces, when done well, are honest. They throw out convention and demand what's needed. They can be anything. They don't give a fuck. Stories are tomorrow, and they are spaces to share stories created by and built for us. I find the idea of what a radical, relaxed performance space can be so fucking exciting.
So the second theme I want to talk about is the link between allyship and access. Our presenters told us about their different approaches to being an ally with disabled communities and what allyship means in the context of access. Disabled and non-disabled artists spoke about how their collaborations with each other enriched their respective practices and expanded their audiences. Presenters also spoke about how ongoing engagement with disabled communities makes their work more engaging and accessible for disabled audiences. And then organisations spoke about the benefits of building trust with disabled communities through long-term relationships. So the first clip I want to show is Andy Arnold, Artistic Director of Tron Theatre, and theatre maker Ramesh Mayappan talk about collaborating together on Off Kilter.
Me and Andy, as he said, we work brilliantly together. He's a brilliant director. And the reason for that is that he's so open-minded. And that's really important. You need somebody that's open-minded, that you can listen, that you can discuss, that you can kind of bounce ideas off each other, that you can collaborate with. And so through that process, although it was challenging, and of course, because we were doing a piece that didn't involve any spoken language or any sign language, and for me, as a person who I've been like over 20 years without using sign language in my work. And the reason for that is I didn't want to have an interpreter have to stand on stage. I didn't want to have captions. I wanted people to see the piece itself. I wanted to create something that was so visual and rewarding in that aspect, that you could use deaf and hearing actors, that you could have an audience who was deaf or hearing, and that they could just completely immerse themselves in what was happening on stage.
As a director, working with Andy as a director, he has this really kind of visual way of working, which made me kind of sort of step back and get another perspective on it, you know. Andy's a hearing person, and he lives in that hearing world. I'm a deaf man, and I come from a deaf world. So we had these two very different perspectives that we could work alongside each other, interchanging, and to always consider in the back of our head that it was an audience we were trying to get to, a hearing audience, a deaf audience, and to try and find that visual language that we could tell our story in was, you know, really useful. So it was about trying not to focus in on myself as a deaf person, but to really open that out and feel that and use it in the project.
So it's a journey that I never anticipated, and it's been very rewarding, and it also led to far more use of BSL integrated into other productions of the Tron as well, which is something we do now all the time.
Next, we have Battersea Arts Centre in London's inclusive practice manager Kelsey Acton discusses how her approach to innovation within Access is always tied to having strong relationships with disabled communities.
So the second performance I'll talk about, Careful by Cripsy, I was involved with, but I'm supplementing my memory by reviewing a document Cripsy published, reflecting on our experiences doing relaxed performance for the first time. Like literally Titanium, every performance of Cripsy was, Careful, was relaxed. What's striking, looking at the document, is the focus on physical space. The physical accessibility of the venue we highlighted, but we used as highlighted. So there's a note saying, door buttons available, wide hallways and doors, accessible washrooms. And most strikingly, the document describes an audience space that can accommodate a number of different embodiments and movement needs. So mats at the front for children and people who prefer to sit on the floor, couches, cabaret seating, so that wheelchair users could easily reconfigure the seating to come sit with the people they came with, and riser seating at the back for people who can climb stairs and who preferred to view dance from an angle. Like clearly Titanium, in this I see an implicit understanding that disabled audiences have a particular relationship to physical space that they're in and need time and control over that space. So this attention to the relationship with the audience and the focus on scent-free spaces and use of phones are variations and innovations on relaxed performance that I haven't yet to see in the UK, although much like everyone else, my capacity to see theatre has been quite limited by the past few months. And while I can't speak for literally Titanium, I know that with Careful, these variations on relaxed performance came partly because of my own access to information about relaxed performance, and partly because of relationships to the community. When I found out that relaxed performances were a thing that we could and should be doing, the main resource available to me about how to produce a relaxed performance was a free Dance USA webinar. I can safely describe it as one of the most ableist things I have ever experienced. However, the terribleness of that experience gave us a kind of permission to experiment. The initial group of people who founded the group that would become Cripsy had a high percentage of manual wheelchair users among them. As a result, we all had experiences going to events that separated us from the people we came with because of fixed seating. The addition of the couches came from our stage manager, Julie Ferguson, who experiences a lot of pain and shortness of breath. I've also anecdotally heard of some disability arts groups in the States who are beginning to use couches and beanbags, chairs as audience seating for really similar reasons. Likewise, there were a lot of people in our community who used phones as a tool to manage pain, dissociation, and discomfort. We wanted to make it really clear to them that they were welcome to use any and all tools they had to make themselves comfortable.
Next, we have Take Me Somewhere's associate producer Carl Taylor and deaf artist and producer Jamie Ree discussing their approach to building trust with disabled artists and audiences.
And so often, I think in the arts, there's been a history of the arts being very inaccessible for deaf and disabled people. So there's a lack of trust, I think is fair to say. And so we're often starting from that point and trying to build like an assumption that something may not be accessible. And so we need to build confidence and trust and an open dialogue to build trust over time. And so our launch for the festival was co-hosted by our artistic director, LJ, and the wonderful Jamie, which in English and in BSL. And I think this is a nice example of the way we want to approach collaboration and communication as basically co-hosting, co-welcoming in 2 different languages, as opposed to Jamie just kind of interpreting what LJ is saying. We want to put a message out of like, hello, we're colleagues and you're both welcome to this thing. It maybe wasn't super successful. We needed to rehearse a little bit more, but we're going to learn for that for next year. So whilst, in terms of building audiences, we spoke about, the need of building trust over time. It's about making personal, we've found Glasgow is a small city, so we try and make personal invitations and to targeted organisations and networks. Take Me Somewhere is queer and weird. So some of the work is not going to be particularly of interest to people who love Shakespeare necessarily. That's fine. So for example, we established a close relationship with the performance course in BSL and English at the RCS and visited the students to meet them in person and find out what they enjoy and make personal connections that have built up over many years. That's where Jamie and I met initially.
And so the third theme I want to talk about is the tension between exploration and instruction. So one of the main barriers we identified is that theatre makers felt they needed greater guidance on how to make their work accessible. So in event feedback, for example, people often requested information to be centralised into case studies, how-to guides, and clearly defined terms. Yet many of our invited speakers spoke about how making their work accessible requires a commitment to doing things differently, to experimenting beyond what's typically done. So there's clearly a balance that needs to be struck between these two demands, between spaces to explore and also guidance and instruction for other people to get involved. But it's not something we've figured out yet. So here's Ink Asher Hemp questioning whether fixing what is and isn't a relaxed performance is helpful for disabled theatre makers and audiences.
At the moment, there are not very many relaxed performances, and those that are incredibly varied in what they're providing. Some of the work is amazing, such as that we've heard about today, but on the whole, it can often feel like the standard just now is fairly lax. Sometimes you go to a show and it feels like a joke. So do we need some kind of rigid structure, some form of regulatory accountability process? More and more I hear calls for like a sector-wide definition of what a relaxed performance is. And although this might seem like an obvious route, it may somewhat simplify the process of making relaxed work and therefore encourage more people to make it. I would like to question the merits of this as a solution. As a small-scale theatre maker, I would be concerned about it becoming incredibly specific and tied up in rules, that we would be adding bureaucracy that would support larger companies and budgets and hinder smaller ones. I don't want the process of making accessible work itself to become inaccessible. And if we have a rigid framework, perhaps we would see a growth in the creation of relaxed shows, but more is not necessarily better. Do we want 300 new shows using a cut and paste formula that don't think about access creatively, but just follow a plan without interrogating it? At the moment, we as a community of creators have ownership of the evolution of these spaces, and that's not something I want to lose.
This clip includes Mary Taylor, executive producer at Birds of Paradise, talking about how making work accessible is a process, as well as interpreter Amy Cheskin talking about the value of getting things wrong.
But what can I say about the Fringe First and Herald Award winning My Left Right Foot the musical and the war-in of activity around such a production that is helpful learning for other people? I don't really feel like packaging up a neat case study. It feels somehow disingenuous to me at this point and boring. I think this is because I'm a bit fatigued by presenting what I know as advice, and it has something to do with yet again talking to my computer. Albeit, I think there are real people beyond the screen, even if I'm yet again sitting in my living room talking aloud. With each bot production, it is true, we plan towards an on-stage experience that is as accessible as possible. That we plan accessible outreach and finally marketing and resources that further open up the production for people with specific impairments. From the outset and at each stage, we embed access in everything that we do. How many times have I written that phrase? What does it really mean? I'm going to break this down to do something slightly different than a case study. If a case study is a polished little nugget of look at what we did, what worked and what didn't, why don't we be a little bit more exposing and look at the process as it moves along? Let's admit it, none of us really ever end up exactly where we set out to go. And along the way, we have successes and failures and mediocre moments that are to a varying degree in our control.
Yeah, and I think if you don't ever do things wrong, you're never going to get the feedback as to how to do things right. Like that's the truth. If the choice is between I either do it perfect or I don't do it at all, I think you're missing so much, because people, then nobody's ever going to do it because we're all scared of, being perfect and doing things wrong. But I think if you come to it creatively and go, look, let's try this. Does this work? If everybody turns around and goes, no, you go, great. And I think it's the same as you said earlier, Andy, that you approach it like any other creative process. Great, that didn't work. Now I know that didn't work. Or, okay, that didn't work for this. It's a really great idea. Doesn't work for this. Let's try it somewhere else. And so I think it's, about keeping your hands open, keeping, a really open view as to what you can do.
This clip shows Bryony McIntyre, co-director of Arica, describing how, as a festival, they approach access as a common capacity shared by everyone.
Yeah, so we've got our Arica desk. So that's a place sort of away from the box office, particularly in the, venues are different. The tramway, the reception's right by the door, maybe doesn't feel super friendly sometimes. So we wanted to place a kind of a desk further into the kind of body of the theatre space. So you can go up and you can ask for requests, find out where the live captioning is going to be, where the BSL interpreter is going to stand, ask for a chair, etc. And that's been working really pretty well. We also include like an access request statement on all of our kind of like publicity and marketing, just so to highlight the option that people can be in touch with us about any kind of needs that we might not have already put in kind of place. The most recent statement that we had is, I'll just read it, is we're operating from the point of view of access intimacy. Access isn't an individual's need, but a common capacity shared between us all. If there is anything we can do to make attending the episode easier for you, please let us know and we will try to help. So hopefully that's a sort of like open statement where people can kind of like reach out, and people do to sort of tend to use that as a route to be in touch with us about stuff.
And so the last theme I want to talk about is just the idea of changing attitudes. So our invited speakers spoke about the importance of developing relationships with venues and audiences in order to make accessible work. And some of this work done by disabled artists was focused on shifting the attitudes of non-disabled people, but much of this work was also centred on in fact, maybe the majority of it was centered on building trust and deepening relationships with disabled audiences, artists and communities, sort of shifting their attitudes to whether they can access these spaces. So the first clip is Amy Leach and Anna Kellner from Leeds Playhouse, as part of the Ramps on the Moon consortium, are speaking about their strategy of marketing by stealth for their production of Oliver.
So what's interesting about Oliver Twist and what Amy said about it is whenever, from a comms perspective, marketing and communications, we always start with what the product is. So we would always want our marketing assets, so that's any imagery, any video content, anything like that, to be truly reflective of the product, of what audiences are going to see. It's important to us that we both get audiences in, but we don't try and do that under false pretenses. So actually something like Oliver Twist, which was fully integrated, is a real opportunity for us really to make sure that our marketing assets are approached in the same way. So a big title is a gift because we want audiences to come to that. So Amy and Michelle from Ramps on the Moon talk a lot about stealth marketing. So it wasn't like we made a conscious effort to make sure we had disabled representation in our marketing assets. It just becomes part of our marketing assets because we work collaboratively with the creative team around that. And that's where working with someone like Amy is really, really great, because she runs a very open rehearsal room, so you can really get to sort of the core of how the team are working. So the messages were important for us. The key messages are the messages of the show, about it being a great story, which is very entertaining, but then also that this cast is fully integrated. But that came through really, the messaging about the story of Oliver Twist, more than anything, I would say. I'd say one of the biggest things we did learn is about working together. And I think having worked with the Ramps on the Moon consortium, I've been there working in marketing since the very beginning of that partnership. Really, each year it's been great learning to work with the different venue partners who have all been all bringing different experience from that. And each year, I think, as a whole consortium of venues, so that's the Playhouse and Sheffield Theatre. Oh gosh, I've started listing now. I'll forget someone. Ipswich, New Wellesley, and a couple of others. Working with them, we all sort of learn from each other. And the important thing with Ramps on the Moon as well, obviously, is getting that message out there of those artists on stage. But it's important as well to make sure if you're creating integrated work, that then the audience is reflective of that. So we would do that through the stealth marketing. So just making sure all of our assets are accessible. But then also we would target groups as well through specific relationships. And actually working with a lot of the people who were part of the project, it gave us the opportunity to engage with people and say, oh, you know, where do you get your information from? Probably one of the most interesting bits of.
And now we have Claire Cunningham describing how her approach to international touring has changed as she seeks to have more meaningful relationships with the local communities that she's touring to.
There's been an ongoing interest for many years in my work from other countries. This interest is often related to my performance work being presented as part of local attempts to shift awareness of the potential of disabled artists in those countries. And I'm invited in to show work and to give workshops to share skills and experience with local disabled artists, or to be part of attempts to further dialogue about the status of work by disabled artists. So I guess that's one aspect of working internationally for me, is that quite often the work goes beyond just presenting a show. Quite often there are a number of other activities around that event, which goes part way towards places getting the most out of the artists that they've brought, getting their money's worth. But it also works both ways. For me, it also makes sense to try and spend more time in a place. Early on, I used to be doing a lot of doing one show and then going somewhere else, which is also a really particular problem in dance. It's incredibly tiring. And so partly through invitation to do more, and partly I also chose to expand what I do when I'm invited somewhere. I really hate the sort of drop in, do a show, fly out experience. For one, it's not very environmentally friendly, obviously, anymore, but also I began to want more opportunities to meet and engage with local artists, particularly disabled artists, and to build relationships with audiences and venues or programmers. I think it is increasingly important for venues to bring artists for substantial periods of time. The connections made to local communities are always more tangible and have more potential for ongoing relationships.
Lastly, Chisato Minamimura describes how touring her work internationally has changed her audience's attitudes.
When I toured in Canada, Scored in Silence often had a Q&A after it, which was a very popular thing to do. And we did that in Tunisia as well. And in Canada, what happened was the performance finished and I took my bow, and then I headed backstage to change out of my costume in order to come back for the Q&A. And while I was doing that, the technical team put the Q&A in motion and got the interpreter together, seated ready for me when I came in. So she was sitting opposite me, so she was in the audience. But when I came in, it kind of started, so I just sat next to the BSL interpreter to wait for a chance to go and sit on the panel. And someone from the audience said, "Oh, I love this piece. Can you tell me who was the lead artist in this? Who really made this happen?" And all eyes went to the technical team. All eyes went to this technical crew, to the team that we had. And my producer that I previously had, Sarah, and she not Tom, but Sarah, she simply made the eyes turn and say it was Chisato's piece of work. This is her production. And that caused a bit of a shock in the audience, actually. And a Canadian deaf woman who was in the audience said, "So that means if Chisato can do it and she's deaf, Canadian deaf artists can do this as well." And I said, absolutely we can do this. So that was a really nice moment.
To finish, I just want to share some tips, certainly not all, for making accessible work that we've gathered from doing these events. The first is start early. Build thinking about access and how people are going to access your work into the early stages of generating your ideas. It's much easier to keep thinking about access than to sort of retroactively apply it to a piece of work you've already made. The second is to do your research. If you're interested in BSL interpretation, for example, check out what other companies have done, speak to interpreters, ask questions and see what else has been done already. The third, I think, is really important to listen to your audience. If you're interested in making work for deaf audiences, for example, have a conversation with them, find out about what their experience of seeing work has been like, what sort of things interest them. I think it's really important. The fourth is to work with disabled people, to collaborate with them. If you're interested in making your work accessible, remember that representation within a project will increase the effectiveness of whatever access means you're likely to put in place, but also that representation on stage in project is equally important part of making work accessible to disabled audiences. The fifth is to play about. While it's understandable to want to know how to do things, one of the best ways to learn is to try things out and see what works. And that rolls on into number 6, which is just to keep testing it out as well. Repeatedly show work to audiences and get feedback from them, like you would as with any other aspects of a performance. Test it out. You don't want to find out if it works on opening night. Number 7, build long-term relationships with your audience. Invest that time in building trust with them. Make them feel that coming to see your show is going to be a good experience. 8, be honest about what you can offer. Don't confuse marketing copy with sort of stating clearly what you're doing to make your show accessible. You don't want to bring people in under false pretenses. Number 9, budget for access. Make the case to funders that making your work accessible will require funding, and that will allow you to do a lot more if you are funded for it as well. And number 10, ask for help. Give Birds of Paradise a shout if you have any questions about things. There's a community of theatre makers interested in making accessible work, and you only have to reach out and ask. That's pretty much us. So I just want to say thank you so much for tuning into this sort of summary of Make It Accessible. And if you want to learn more about the whole series of events or to view all event recordings, just check out the website. Thanks.